Thank you for joining in. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week, Diplomatic Channel takes a closer look into the Africa tours by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and the French President Emmanuel Macron. Importance of the visits and Africa's role in the Russia-Ukraine invasion. My guest is public political strategist and COO of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Dr. Tayo Adeloju. But first, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles. The Nigerian government has condemned the gruesome murder of Mr. Alika Ogochukwu in Civitanova Marche province of Italy by an unnamed Italian man on July 29, 2022. A statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs states that the federal government calls on the government of Italy to bring the perpetrator of the heinous act under the jurisdiction of the law without delay. The ministry has directed the embassy in Rome to remain seized of the development and work speedily with the relevant Italian authorities to ensure that justice is served to forestall a repeat of the incident. Ambassador Ben Okoying has presented his letters of credence as the non-resident High Commissioner of Nigeria to the Governor General of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. His Excellency, the Most Honorable Cornelius Alvin Smith, who warmly congratulated and welcomed Ambassador Okoying to the Bahamas and wished him every success in his responsibilities. He further extended his warm greetings to President Muhammadu Buhari and expressed his government's desire to move relations between the two countries higher. And finally, the Rwandan High Commission in Nigeria has celebrated 28 years of the country's liberation with a reception at its office in Abuja. Among invited guests are members of the diplomatic corps, representatives of the Nigerian and Rwandan government, the business community, and Friends of Rwanda. Liberation Day in Rwanda comes up on July 4. It marks the end of the genocide and the defeat of the government that executed it on July 4, 1994.
On behalf of my spouse, the staff of the High Commission, I am immensely pleased and honored to welcome you to this August celebration.
Welcome back. Certain countries in Africa played host to the French President Emmanuel Macron and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov as both countries, leaders of both countries that is, sought to strengthen ties with Africa as the Russia war in Ukraine deepens.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov began his visit to the Egyptian capital Cairo just a couple of days after Russia, Ukraine and the UK signed a deal on the resumption of Ukrainian exports from the Black Sea. Egypt, one of the world's wheat importers, has been torn between long-standing ties to Russia and its close relationship to Western powers that have sanctioned and sought to isolate Moscow. Lavrov assured Egypt of grain supplies from Russia. But when he spoke at a press briefing later, Mr. Lavrov said that any ships coming from Ukrainian ports to pick up additional grain will be inspected to make sure they don't bring any weapons, which will be detrimental to the continued conflict. Mr. Lavrov's visit included a trip to Uganda, Congo and Ethiopia. His visit aimed at courting the countries to get more friends and convincing them that Russia was not responsible for the food crisis, dismissing the claims as another attempt to shift the blame to others. And as the Russian foreign minister continued his visit to Africa, the French President Emmanuel Macron touched down in Cameroon on Monday, July the 25th. While in Cameroon, the French president criticized Russia's influence in Africa, deeming it a preoccupation for the continent's people. Speaking alongside President Paul Biya, President Macron said Russia's presence in Africa is based on misinformation, militias and complicity with weakened powers. He described France as a friend of Africa. Many African nations are facing food and energy issues due to their dependence on Russian grain and energy, but they also buy Ukrainian grain that has been disrupted by the conflict. African governments have largely avoided taking sides and refused to join Western condemnation and sanctions over Russia's behavior. But anti-French sentiment is rising in France's former West African colonies, where security and political instability following a string of coups are stoking frustration and swinging public opinion in favor of Russia. President Paul Biya, whose government signed a cooperation agreement with Russia in April, said the accord is normal and constituted only an act of managing its bilateral relations with the country, in effect since 2015. While in Benin Republic, the French president met with President Patrice Talon. He told him that France aims to respond positively to requests from Benin and other countries for air support and intelligence to combat Islamist militants. President Macron's visit to Africa ended in Guinea-Bissau on Wednesday, where he was received at the Osvaldo Ferreira Airport by his Guinean counterpart Umaru Embalo. President Macron promised to revive bilateral relations by supporting the country's agricultural sector and pledged to continue backing West African states in their battle against terrorism.
I have joining me economist and Chief Operating Officer and Senior Fellow Public Policy at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Dr. Tayo Adeloju. Thank you for joining me on Diplomatic
Thank you
Channel.
for having me.
So we're talking about, the visits by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and the French President Emmanuel Macron to Africa. Both of them visited different countries. There were their paths never crossed during these visits. What do you make of, the timing of their Africa focus?
Well, I think it comes at the right time. If you look at the Ukraine-Russia crisis, has entered the phase where ramping up global support for either side of the conflict is crucial to diplomatic sustenance of Russia, whom the West have diplomatically isolated. And so Macron, because a lot of the countries where we are now seeing the asymmetric influence of Russia in Africa are actually, Mali, Southern Sudan, used to be, basically the Sahel used to be the default space of France, but now you are seeing Russia play a political competition in the Sahel. So I think that in Macron's mind, it's time to come. Of course, French troops being forced out of Mali is also a signal that Russia has an upper hand in a previously French
but they were expelled by the military junta.
Yes,
in Mali.
who it seems now has significant support, however indirect, from Russia. So those types of power competition, axial power competition, will increase in Africa. So they are here at the right time. If you look at Lavrov's, the countries they visited, he's visited the traditional partners of Russia, particularly the economic partners of Russia and the trade partners of Russia. Nigeria tends to be more of the military political partnership. So Nigeria, Central African Republic, and Sudan have the more military cooperation partnership. So it's possible that Russia thinks that is locked in. But it seems as if on this visit, the partners on energy, security, economy, and trade were the places that Lavrov prioritized versus the classical visit of Macron, which itinerary is focused on classical partners, Cameroon, Benin, Guinea-Bissau. And that gives you a sense of him playing the traditional script of the post-colonial francophone type diplomatic ties. And it seems as if that will be France's play. But clearly, when you look at Russia and France, it's interesting that this is going on because Macron, of all Western leaders, has invested the largest, amount of time, maybe there's the number 100 hours in engaging with Putin.
Of all the Western leaders.
Yeah,
really.
He has been the one with the largest amount of face time. And so he has engaged more. So I think Macron's mindset is there is no political stability in Europe without Russia, so we have to engage. I think that has been his policy towards Russia, um, and that has been France's posture.
But then again, you almost think that, there is, Macron's visit kind of reeks of a protection of, its own powers on the continent. As much as it's seeking, Russia's cooperation with ending this war, it also wants to protect its own relations on the continent, as Lavrov is also there.
Absolutely. In fact, there are two things to just remember. One is that as Russia moves into this phase where it starts to do the gas and energy cuts in the West, it also needs to bolster other forms of cooperation. I am certain that Russia is reaching out and opening up the food supply chains was not simply a concession to Ukraine. It's in its interest to also be able to trade in terms of food, etc. And so I think what you're going to see as we go on is not just France, but the other countries in the West project in Africa the fundamental axial power play. And this is where Africa needs to be careful because potentially we will become the proxy battleground for great power competition of different types. And so Africa needs to be clear that this is an opportunity for economics, for trade, for security cooperation, but Africa also needs to be ready to deal with the potential threats of proxy great power play on the continent. But look, Africans are typically non-aligned nations. Since the Cold War, we have basically taken a position on anything by the default non-alignment treaties that we sign on to.
And we seem to be doing that with, the Russian.
Yes, so I think when you look at the voting pattern of most of...
Yeah, but the French president did call African leaders out on that, on their sitting on the fence, and saying they do have to take sides at this time.
Well, the question for Africa as non-aligned nations is, what is this about, right? Is this, the argument about the sovereignty of a state being invaded by an invading force? Of course, Russia has pushed back to say the West did invade Iran, there was Iraq, there was Syria, and points to those as examples of... but
don't we have examples on the continent as well? I mean, some people in the DRC feel those Rwandan soldiers there are also invading.
Absolutely. So the big question with the global rule-based system, which is what Macron is in Africa to push, is Africa better off supporting a global rule-based system within which we can adjudicate for sovereign states and their rights? Or are we better off with the axial play of powers where a few very powerful countries can impose authoritarian rule? Like I said, there are a few countries in East and Central Africa, and now one or two in the Sahel, where they basically are playing the role of an asymmetric partner in military support. The stronger partners like Ethiopia on energy cooperation, Angola and Mozambique on trade, have always been the traditional partners, and there's some new deals in that regard. Nigeria has gotten some support on military assistance cooperation. I don't think we've done anything big on economic cooperation yet. So if you think of that and you compare that with the EU's broad set of partnership agreements, the EU has signed an interim partnership agreement with Ghana, one with South Africa that is in the works, Kenya, Rwanda. I know Nigeria is going to go back and look at it, Morocco. So you see that there's also the EU projecting its economic influence. But with the huge ODAs, official development assistance coming from the EU into Africa, one wonders whether we'll see that type of power projection, the traditional tools, trade, investment, development assistance, etc., come from Russia.
My conversation with Dr. Tayo Adeloju continues after the break. Stay with us. And now back to my conversation with Professor Jonathan Aremu. Lavrov reassured Africa of its supply of grains, but we also need to find out what Africa can actually offer Russia in the end, apart from a large market. How can both sides mutually benefit from this relationship?
Well, to be honest, when you think of strategic grains, our strategic grain reserves across Africa coming under strain due to the shortages, two questions you must ask is what has happened to Africa's own food self-sufficiency agenda that we set under NAPAD, and why hasn't that, at a time of global strain in global food supply chains, why hasn't it kicked off? One of the reasons is because we're not seeing enough of the domestic policies accelerating at the rate required to even meet local demand, domestic demand within countries.
Even for Nigeria.
Even for Nigeria. So if you look at the demand and supply, for example, of grains in Nigeria, we were depending 99% of the wheat, for example, we were using was imported. We only had 1% in. Now imagine that on wheat alone, you suddenly have to turn that over to try and be self-sufficient. It's almost impossible to pull off in the short term. So I think the bigger question for Africa is, particularly if we want to stay non-aligned, is what would it take for Africa's strategic food and agriculture programs to accelerate, to feed Africa first, and then feed the world. That was in the NAPAD agenda, that we would be self-sufficient in food, and then we'll go beyond that to be the major supplier of food to the world. It's critical to do that because that is also part of our strategic workforce deployment. It's critical to exploiting the potential of Africa. Africa cannot depend for all its grains. So there are opportunities where the market, because of the conflict, the West is looking elsewhere for products, alternatives to exporters into their economies of products that they need, grains, gas, etc. The question is whether we would be able to ramp up. In Nigeria, we're having a challenge currently meeting our quota of just oil production because of all the insecurities, oil theft, bunkering, opacity in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria. So the question is, can we ramp up? Because ramping up gas production is a supply chain issue. It's not simply producing more gas. It's vessels, it's ships, it's ports, it's pipelines. It's a massive project. And by the way, it's not a new project. We had envisaged the West African gas pipeline decades ago. Again, it's the pace at which Africa is integrating infrastructure to be competitive. And I think that's the biggest issue. Without intra-African trade, which sits on intra-African infrastructure, rails, pipelines, roads, seaports that link with each other seamlessly across Africa, it's very hard to optimize production and trade within Africa. And that's likely the biggest thing that will slow down our capacity to execute the African free trade area and market. If you can't do that, then it's tough. Now scaling up as you need to scale up. Well, there are opportunities. I think energy is an opportunity. Countries that can find the investment, create the partnership and the guarantees.
Are these, could you term this the benefits of neutrality?
Actually, maybe the benefits of non-neutrality, because the fact is, if the West starts to look elsewhere for gas or grains, as the case may be, they would want to look for countries that can give them assurances that they will suddenly not be susceptible to being persuaded not to fulfill their quota when the time comes, right? And that's why the question of being aligned or non-aligned is tricky. you have to sign enough trade deals, military deals, energy deals with one partner to make it work, right? Or the size, the structure, the nature of it has to be locked in. The sense of it being locked in creates a partnership. The partnership may not go, or go well with one partner, Russia. If the EU signs a deal on gas with Nigeria, for example, very likely we'll have a cold shoulder from Russia. So each country ultimately needs to do for themselves what works economically and with trade. I think at the UN we will continue to see non-aligned countries, like most of the African countries are non-aligned, behave the way they have behaved, which is abstain from voting. But in trade and economics, we may see a very different dynamic.
Yeah. And I wanted you to compare, the relations that African countries have with, the EU, with the US, which is threatened countries that still have partnerships with Russia, with harsher economic sanctions, and then with China.
So the first thing is, when we look at China as an international or global power, China and Russia seem to have similar but different strategies. China is out to be the dominant global power and to shape the global order. That's very different from the overall posture of Putin's Russia, which is primarily to displace an axial power, Western power, in particular Europe. And this war has removed one critical competitive advantage of Europe: peace. The one thing you could boast of in Europe was a sense of tangible, predictable peace. And now we have a full-blown war in Europe. And so they first don't have the same agenda, so they behave differently. So for example, Russia projects most of its state power in Africa through what is more measures that are a little bit indirect. So you don't see the traditional tools of cooperation, trade, investments, official development assistance, etc., dominantly across Africa. You see a lot of that from China. And you see a lot. So China is technologically, politically, diplomatically, militarily, socially, culturally vested in shaping the global order. And because of that big difference, I think China looks at the Russia-Ukraine war they're basically taking notes and comparing that with their posture to Taiwan. And I think what we will see is China is learning quickly about the dynamics and likely playing scenarios on how the axial powers will respond to Taiwan, and maybe what the trajectory of deterrence need to be in advance of that.
Probably hence its warning to the U.S. president
about
absolutely. The speaker visiting Taiwan.
Absolutely. So you see certain more proactive postures that they are taking on Taiwan, and I think they're taking a lot of notes from the Russian-Ukraine conflict. But I think when you look at Russia, Putin has typically, at the core of his strategy since he came into power almost 2 decades ago, has really been one where some amount of violence and war was required. So you had Chechnya, you had Georgia, you had, of course, you had the Syrian conflict, and you had the annexation of Crimea, etc., etc., etc. And usually there's a pretext. It's normally a limited war, and I honestly think this is just reading the script and the trend that they thought that the Ukraine war would have been a limited war. It seemed to be the pattern he has played. Proxy and limited wars has been his style. I think with Ukraine, there were miscalculations that played out ultimately into the full-blown war. So many surprises.
And many more ahead anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Tanya Adeloju, thank you so much. We could go on and on having this discussion, but I appreciate your being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is where we end the program this week. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.